Today's moderator is Dr. Steve Conway, the Mental Health and Wellness Director here at the Alliance. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks, Shirley, and welcome everybody to this webinar today. Today, I'm joining you from the Fraser Valley office of the Manufacturing Safety Alliance of BC, located in Chilliwack on the traditional and unceded territories of the Stalo Coast Nation people. We're grateful for the opportunity to speak from you from these shared lands this morning. The Manufacturing Safety Alliance is a not-for-profit health and safety association for manufacturers and food processors in British Columbia. Call on us anytime for health and safety training, advice, and resources. We can also advise and support you towards core certification, the occupational safety standard for excellence in manufacturing. Thank you for joining us for this year's first Make It Safe Expert Series webinar, Shift Away from Workplace Fatigue. I'm relatively new to the Alliance, having joined late last year in a new role focused on mental health and wellness. Well, I'm not going to be providing any counseling. I do invite employers to contact me for guidance and coaching and for support as you develop new mental health and wellness initiatives. By ensuring that workers are healthy and safe mentally as well as physically, we make our businesses stronger and more sustainable. At the Alliance, we are here to support the continuous improvement of your health and safety programs to prevent injuries and promote workplace wellness. One key factor in personal wellness and workplace health and safety is sleep and the fatigue we fight at work when we don't get the sleep we need. And this is something I have personally dealt with for many, many years, and I'm really interested in hearing what Dr. Glenn Landry has to say. So today, we have invited Dr. Glenn Landry, President and Chief Sleep Officer of CRS Circadian Rhythms and Sleep, to give us new information and tools to help us identify the risks and sleep better. Before we hear from Glenn, I'd like to remind you that you can ask questions using the Q&A icon at any time during the session. We will hold questions until the end. Welcome, Glenn, and I just want to know, did you get a good night's sleep last night?
Yes, thanks very much for having me. Let's see to make sure we can see the video. Yeah, we're there. And yes, I did my very best, even though we had a windstorm, and you'll see what the impact of a windstorm has on my sleep. But yes, to answer your question, thank you.
Right on.
All right, so thank you everyone for joining us today. I just want to make sure that everybody can see the screen. Are we good? I'll take that as a yes. All right, so today's session, we are going to be, I really want to accomplish three things. The first is I want to spend some time. It's going to be about a 90-minute session. We'll try to leave lots of time for questions at the end. And the three main things that I want to address today are why sleep is so important, why it matters as much as it does. And then I want to get into some of the reasons why you may not be getting the sleep that you need. And then finally, I want to at least begin the process of helping you improve your sleep by explaining exactly why circadian rhythms are the secret to sleep health. And I'll explain all about what circadian rhythms are and why they're so important. But before I do, I want to just give you a little bit of an introduction into, who I am and what I do. So I came to the sleep field honestly, because as a teen, I simply could not sleep. My, circadian rhythms, my daily biological rhythms just resulted in me not being able to fall asleep. I had dutiful parents. They wanted me to be in bed for 10:30 as a teen, but I found that I simply couldn't fall asleep. And so it wasn't until 3 or 4 in the morning that I would finally be able to fall asleep, which obviously made, 7 a.m. wake ups for 8:30 classes really, really difficult for me. And so that began my interest in sleep and sleep deprivation in particular. In those years, I felt like I functioned best on 4 to 5 hours of sleep. And it wasn't until I got into the university years that I really learned how to take control of my sleep. And that was a game changer for me. I met Dr. Ralph Misselberger at Simon Fraser University, world-renowned expert in circadian rhythms and sleep. And so I was really fortunate that I got to have access to this, information. And that really began my journey. I've been studying sleep and circadian rhythms for over 25 years now. I've been in private practice going on my 8th year now. And that led to, me really getting an understanding of the science that you're about to see today. Everything that I present to you today is consensus science. World experts agree. None of the material that I'm showing you today is contentious. This is, as I say, consensus science. So let's begin with a subject that I'm sure we're all really tired of talking about, and that is COVID-19. One of the things that I want you to understand is that sleep is an important tool that we have at our disposal, and it can be a game changer in terms of providing us an inoculation, if you will, to prevent or at least decrease the lived experience of something like COVID-19. Now, I'm talking about combating a pandemic here. And when we do that, we're really talking about addressing something called the reproduction rate. The reproduction rate is just simply the rate at which a disease or a pathogen can spread throughout a population. And the thing that makes COVID-19 so problematic is that it spreads so easily. And so the reproduction rate is really a function of the transmission rate, how easy it is for the pathogen to spread from person to person. And that is divided by the recovery rate, how quickly someone recovers after having been exposed and actually ending up with, getting COVID-19, how quickly they can recover from that virus. And so when we're talking about combating something like COVID-19, really what we have at our disposal in our goal to reduce the reproduction rate, we have two choices. One is to decrease the transmission rate, and the other is to increase recovery rate. And what I'm about to show you very quickly with some science, and this is, decades old science now, but we've known for decades that sleep has an impact on immune system function. So what I'm about to show you isn't COVID specific, but it is immune system function related. And those mechanisms are the same no matter what pathogen that you're facing. So here's an example of how healthy sleep reduces the risk of infection. Now, this was a simple study that was done with college students. And what they did, what was novel about this study is they looked at the sleep health of the individuals prior to exposure. So what we have is actigraphic, think research grade Fitbit now. But what we have is in advance of exposure to a pathogen, we have a measurement of how well the individuals or the participants in the study were sleeping. And what we can see is that each individual is exposed, and what in this case, it was the common cold, so something called the rhinovirus, and they used a nasal spray to make sure that every participant in the study was equally exposed to that pathogen. And what they found is that the sleep in advance of exposure had a dramatic impact on whether or not individuals actually got the cold. Again, this is for the common cold, but these immune system function factors are exactly the same, no matter what pathogen that you're dealing with. What we can see is that individuals that were getting less than 5 hours of actual sleep each night, well, almost half of those individuals that were exposed to the common cold actually ended up coming down with a cold. And then, as you can see, there's this dramatic decline in risk as a function of hours slept in advance. And so what we see here, this comparison I'm showing you is important because we know from actigraphic studies worldwide that people are getting less than 7 hours of sleep. I'll take you through that in a moment. And what you can see is that if we could just get this group that are getting less than 7 hours of sleep, and get them to just over 7 hours or more than 7 hours, we could get a 20% reduction in the number of people that convert and actually end up coming down with the cold. Another group of interest is this one right here. Shift workers, we know, are getting between 5 and 6 hours of actual sleep each night. And if we were to rectify that and get them to 7 hours, we could get a 30% reduction in the risk of infection. And again, this study was the common cold, but the mechanisms are the same for a pathogen like COVID-19. A 20% reduction or even a 30% reduction makes a huge impact. Now that's risk of infection. But when we look at recovery rate, I won't take you through all of the factors here, but on the left-hand side, you see a number of factors: neutrophils, natural killer cells. All of these factors have been shown to actually improve recovery rate. So in the slides previous, I was talking about, exposure to a virus, but then actually not decreasing the risk of getting infected with that virus. So everybody's exposed, but not everyone is infected. On this slide, what I'm showing you is that if you are unlucky enough to actually be infected, if you're a better sleeper, it dramatically improves your recovery rate. So the lived experience with having had that virus is dramatically improved. So either you will recover quicker or your symptoms won't be as severe. And so in conclusion, I realize I'm pummeling you here, but in conclusion, what I'm really trying to tell you is that we need to promote healthy sleep in order to combat COVID-19 most effectively. And what I would say is, the objective here, again, is to reduce the reproduction rate, how quickly a pathogen is spreading throughout a population. And we do a good job when we talk about things like vaccination and when we talk about PPE or personal protective equipment, masks and hand washing and all of these kinds of things. But what I would say is that we're missing a profound opportunity in society worldwide, and that is to address sleep health as a function of boosting immune system functioning. What I would say, just in summary, is that promoting better sleep health, that's the mask that we wear from within. All right, so improving immune system function, that's one of the reasons why sleep matters so much. But we know that it's much, much more than just immune system functioning. In fact, chronic short duration sleep is a known health hazard for a number of factors: cardiovascular disease, inflammation, obesity, type 2 diabetes, dementia, and even cancer. In 2010, the World Health Organization determined, after a thorough review of the science, that shift work that causes something called circadian dysregulation. You can think of that as turning your nights into days and your days into nights. We'll go into this a little bit further in the slides to come. But again, turning your nights into days and your days into nights, shift work, it causes cancer. We're not talking about just simple correlation here. We're talking about it being a causal factor in much the same way as it's a causal factor for all of the diseases that I've just talked about: cardiovascular disease, inflammation, obesity, type 2 diabetes, dementia, and cancer. We now understand much better than decades before the mechanism by which these risks are increased. And really, to put it simply, you can think of it as we're designed for a 16-hour waking day and an 8-hour sleep window to get at least 7 hours of actual sleep. World experts now agree that the adult human needs 7 to 9 hours of actual sleep each night. It varies from individual to individual within that range of 7 to 9 hours of actual sleep. And when we don't get that sleep, when we get less than 7 hours of actual sleep, what happens is we put our system into overdrive. We have something called the sympathetic nervous system. You can think of that as our fight or flight response. And when we aren't getting the sleep we need, we're actually engaging that system. And that's okay for short term. That's exactly what the system is designed for. It's designed to give us short, brief periods of superhuman performance, if you will. But in the case of an individual that's getting less than 7 hours of actual sleep each night, night after night after night, we're actually over-engaging that sympathetic nervous system. And that, when you overuse the system, is a key driver for all of the factors that we're talking about. Essentially, what you could say is that when we don't get the sleep we need, we're accelerating aging processes. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Well, what I would say is that wakefulness is actually toxic. From the point that we wake up, we are in fact building up toxicity. Sustained wakefulness is toxic because the brain is like an engine. It's producing exhaust, and that exhaust is building up around the neurons throughout our brain. And as I mentioned earlier, 16 hours is the key. We are designed for 16 hours of sustained wakefulness, after which we need an 8-hour sleep window to get at least 7 hours of actual sleep. If we do that in the front half, in those first 4 hours of sleep, it literally washes away the day's waste. Again, brain's like an engine, and when we get the sleep we need, it washes away the day's waste, and then the remaining hours of sleep are used to process learning, consolidate learning and memory, all the things that I'm about to get to in a moment. So again, key point, we're designed for a 16-hour waking day, an 8-hour sleep window on average, to get at least 7 hours of actual sleep. And if we do that, then we begin the next day with a clean slate. But what if we don't? What if we're not getting an 8-hour sleep window, for example? Well, again, the brain is like an engine. You can see you're looking at the brain from the right hand or from the side. And so this is the front of the brain, and these neurons, each neuron is active during the day. And so from the point that we wake up, we are building toxicity. But as long as we get the sleep we need, we literally wash away the day's waste. When we don't get the sleep we need, then we won't have washed the brain fully and done everything that sleep needs to do. And this can build up over time. Here, I'm just talking about 3 successive nights of short duration sleep. That's the equivalent of doing 1 all-nighter. And so what happens is this toxicity builds up, and it's like a tsunami. It builds up in the frontal cortex, and then like a tsunami, a wave of toxicity moves its way from the front to the back of the brain. Now, this matters because these neurons are particularly important. This frontal cortex is really important. One of the reasons that it's so important is that these neurons here actually have been shown to drive a particular stage of sleep called slow wave sleep. And slow wave sleep is the sleep that washes the brain. So when we're building up toxicity in the frontal cortex because we aren't getting the sleep we need, it actually operates like a cascade toward poor health because these neurons are the neurons that drive slow wave sleep. So what that can do when we're talking about chronic short duration sleep is not only will it have an impact on our overall brain health, and when I talk about that, I'm really talking about a decades-long process. Remember earlier I had said that I thought I functioned as a teenager best on 4 to 5 hours of sleep. It wasn't until I got into university that I really got a solid grasp of the sleep science and understood that we have compensatory mechanisms that allow us to compensate for long periods of time, a decades-long process. But make no mistake, if you aren't getting 7 to 9 hours of actual sleep each night, you're really borrowing from the health of your retirement years. But that's not all. On this slide, we're going to talk about the bidirectional relationship between chronic sleep debt and poor mental health. I'm going to show you that we aren't who we think we are when we're sleep deprived chronically. So again, we've got this frontal cortex. You can think of that really as the CEO of the brain. It's responsible for reason, logic, decision-making. It's a brake pedal. Think of it as a control center of the brain. And when we're chronically sleep deprived, these neurons become less effective. Essentially, we're weakening the brake pedal, if you will. And that's really important because not only do we have brake pedals, but we have gas pedals. I'm going to show you two important gas pedals. The first, and I'm simplifying here, but the first is the emotional center of the brain. Think the amygdala now. And this center of the brain, it is responsible for our emotional reactivity to our environment. When we're hyper reactive, things that wouldn't normally bother us become unbearable. On the other side of that spectrum, things that might be funny when we're emotionally reactive become hilarious. So you can see it as these swings from extremes in our emotional reactivity. Now, when we have a fully functioning frontal cortex, it is a brake pedal. It allows us to have very effective control of our emotions. But when we're chronically sleep deprived, that brake pedal is disengaged. And so what happens is that we then become far more emotionally reactive. Let me give you an example for parents in the room. You'll understand exactly what I'm talking about, especially parents of younger children. Imagine a day you take Jimmy to the mall. Jimmy's, say, 6, 7 years old, and you take Jimmy to the mall, and Jimmy decides that, he wants an ice cream, for example. And you're saying, now's not the right time. Sorry, Jimmy, you can't have an ice cream. And all of the sudden, out of nowhere, Jimmy pitches a fit, and you're like, oh my. Now, beyond the embarrassment of having your son pitch a fit in the mall in a public place, instead of calling psych services, you immediately, as a parent, know that Jimmy's just tired. And so you'll say, Jimmy, it's okay. Be calm. You're just tired. You need a nap. Now, what's interesting about that little analogy is that we know instinctively as parents that our children need sleep, and that when they don't get the sleep they need, they can become emotionally reactive. And yet, as adults, for some reason, we lose that connection. We lose the understanding that we too need a nap, or that we too need to protect our sleep. And so emotional reactivity is a key symptom of poor sleep. But that's just one gas pedal. Another gas pedal to talk about is the reward center of the brain. Again, I'm simplifying by talking about the striatum, but the reward center of the brain, think of that as our innermost adrenaline junkie, our risk-seeking appetite. Again, that's a gas pedal. And when we aren't getting the sleep we need, it actually alters our appetite for risk. To give you an example of some laboratory studies, what's been shown is that when you take an individual, the same individual, and you test them in a laboratory setting, when they're sleep deprived, chronically sleep deprived, they become less risk adverse. In fact, what happens is it alters the risk reward analysis. A sleep deprived individual actually tends to underestimate the risk of a given decision and overestimate the reward associated with that decision. That's a key driver. And so what happens when we're sleep deprived is that we aren't as good at making decisions because we no longer evaluate risk reward or cost benefit as effectively. Now, this is really important for us to consider when we talk about employees and we talk about training and making sure that they are who we trained them to be. We really should be understanding that bidirectional relationship of sleep health and decision-making. Let me go through some examples, real-time, real-world examples where individuals made either poor decisions or because of fatigue related to poor sleep health, made poor decisions or actually were unable to execute on their training. So industrial accidents, these are some common examples. One of the things that I want to talk about first is time of day. A lot of the disasters that we see, they center around the hours when we would normally be sleeping. In particular, the hours from, let's say, 2 in the morning until 6 in the morning. That's your big peak right here. And this is what we call a fatigue risk danger zone. I'll talk about this a little bit later, but there's another risk zone, and that's the mid-afternoon. Now, let me take you through an example of laboratory studies on the left-hand side first. What we're talking about is something called the core body temperature minimum. And that is when we're asleep at night, we fall asleep at a peak in our body temperature. And then in the hours just before our normal wake up, the 3-4 hours before our normal wake up, our core body temperature reaches a very low point. In fact, the lowest point in our 24-hour day. And that is associated with a drive for REM sleep. It's also associated with very poor cognitive functioning, the ability to stay awake. Any shift workers in the group will know that those hours from 2 to 6 a.m. are a period where even if you're trying really hard, it's very difficult to stay awake. In this study on the left-hand side, I'll give you an example. You have the people, they come into the lab during the day, and they perform a very simple task. This is the psychomotor vigilance task. It's as simple as just watching a panel of lights. And when the lights are green, there's nothing necessary. But as soon as those lights turn red, you got to click a mouse to reset the system. That's as simple as the task can get. So it's a vigilance task to be able to stay attentive and watch. And as soon as the lights go from green to red, click a mouse button to reset the system. All right, so what we see is when the people come into the lab, they're able to perform this task without making any mistakes whatsoever. This blue shaded area is when they're sleeping in the lab. We measure their sleep to make sure they get a good night's sleep. And then begins a 64-hour sleep deprivation. And what we see is the day after they've slept in the lab, we see 0 mistakes, essentially. They're able to perform the task again. And then there's this massive spike right here. This is where the person, even though there's a research assistant there helping them stay awake, they're having tremendous difficulty attending. They're looking at the panel and the lights go from green to red and the lights are on in terms of the person watching, and yet they're not able to process that information. And so they have this spike in errors. And then after a period of time, even though they haven't gotten sleep, that error rate decreases, not quite to baseline levels, but it does decrease before there's another massive spike in error rate. And what this is an example of how core body temperature minimum, that particular time, think of it as a time of day dependent error rate. It's a time of day when a person is much, much more likely to make mistakes of attention, the inability to attend. In fact, they have micro sleeps where they fall asleep and they aren't even aware that they've fallen asleep. And these are brief periods. We call them sleep intrusions. And so this is important when we're talking about fatigue risk management, because we can predict when people are at greatest risk of fatigue. We actually see this play out in terms of not just laboratory setting, but in the real world. I'll show you that in a moment. One of the things that I want you to think about is that this fatigue level, sustained wakefulness, again, wakefulness is toxic. And this sustaining wakefulness, if we do it for long enough, beyond our designed parameters, again, a 16-hour waking day is what we're designed for unimpaired performance. And then when we go beyond that, we actually begin to see measurable deficits. It's in fact the equivalent, this is blood alcohol level, it's the equivalent of having drunk alcohol in terms of impairment. So when we get beyond 16 hours into 17, 18 hours of sustained wakefulness, it's the equivalent of having a blood alcohol level of 0.05, which in some countries is the legal limit to drive. Anything above 0.05 and you are too drunk to drive. If you push it further than 17, 18 hours and you get into the 18 to 19 hours of sustained wakefulness, the blood alcohol equivalent actually spikes and it becomes 0.08, which is the legal limit here in Canada. And if you go even further into 21 hours of sustained wakefulness, the research shows that the blood alcohol equivalent impairment is about 0.10. That's really sloppy drunk. You're going to be making a ton of attentional errors and inability to actually be situationally aware. And we see this play out, as I mentioned earlier, in the real world, when we look at transport accidents, for example. Now, this chart is controlling for all other factors. And when we look at just circadian time of day, what we can see is that there is this massive spike in the rate of accidents that is a function of the core body temperature minimum. Again, these are single vehicle accidents. These are controlled for all other factors. And what we can see is that core body temperature, that period of time when the brain is programmed for REM sleep, it's a period of time where it's very, very difficult for a person to sustain wakefulness. And so what happens is we have sleep intrusions, and that's a driver for the risk on the roads. But there is this second spike right here, and that is the afternoon lull. If you think back to the slide earlier where I talked about the danger zones, there were these two danger zones in terms of fatigue playing out in the workplace. The first is that core body temperature minimum, again, 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. And the second is about 12 hours offset. It's that period of time in the afternoon between, let's say, 1 to 4 p.m. is really where that plays out, depending on what the sleep schedule is for each individual. All right, so there's an example of how fatigue plays out in the real world as well as a laboratory setting. But let's look at some examples of disasters. So 3 Mile Island, that was a nuclear disaster. Essentially what happened there when we look at it is the sleep-deprived night shift workers failed to notice a stuck valve that was causing the reactor to lose coolant. Now, this is a failure of situational awareness. What happened is they saw the reactor was heating and they were following their standard operating procedures and they opened a valve to cool the reactor. But what's interesting about this is it took them far, far too long to notice that even though they'd opened this valve, the reactor wasn't cooling. In other words, they were programmed to follow a set of procedures, and they felt as though they had followed the procedures. But what was the failure is that these sleep-deprived individuals lacked the capacity for creative thinking to be able to work the problem and notice that there was something happening that was outside of the script. And in this case, what was outside of the script is that the stuck valve just wasn't allowing the coolant to cool the reactor. And it was a very simple fix if they had just identified that. But instead, because it went for as long as it did before somebody finally realized what the problem was, it actually led to a nuclear disaster. Here's another example, but in this case, the Space Shuttle Challenger that exploded, it was later deemed that it was some O-rings that had leaked and allowed fuel to pass through them that led to the explosion. Now, what's interesting about this is that the problem had been identified by engineers, and the risk of these O-rings in cold temperatures not being as flexible and not being able to expand and actually deal with the fuel, that risk had been identified years prior to this disaster. In fact, managers knew about the risk. They'd been warned about the risk. Now, remember earlier when I talked about sleep-deprived individuals not being able to properly assess risk? Well, this is a classic example where the managers who were informed of a risk actually underestimated the likelihood of that risk happening. They made the determination that the cold temperatures weren't likely to be a factor during launch, and therefore they didn't need to go through the long, arduous process of redesigning the system to address the O-ring failure. And because they failed to act, we end up with this disaster. This is a classic example. At that time, NASA was a culture that wore sleep deprivation and the capacity to be able to push through sleep deprivation. They wore that as a badge of honor. And now they understand the importance of protecting everyone's sleep to make sure that they are who they're trained to be. Another example of sleep deprivation having an impact, this is the Chernobyl, another nuclear disaster. Now, in this one, the disaster was attributed to human error, due in part to fatigue while on the night shift, having worked more than 13 hours on that night shift. And what happened in this case was a very simple error. It was a recipe error. They were testing a new recipe for nuclear cake, and it was just a math error, and they literally cooked a reactor. This is another example of fatigue in the workplace. This is the Exxon Valdez oil spill. In this one, we have a third mate that, after being awake more than 18 hours, was fatigued and failed to properly account for the ship's position on the navigational charts. And even though that route was well planned out, they lost situational awareness and ran aground. So again, an example of sleep deprivation playing a key role. Even in well-trained individuals, they lack the capacity to be who they're trained to be when they aren't getting the sleep they need. Here's another example of decision-making. This is American Airlines Flight 1420. In this case, the pilots were coming in for a landing. They were in fact near the end of their 14-hour duty shift. Like, the airline industry understands the importance of sleep and how to manage fatigue. And yet, even with those higher standards, accidents can happen. In this case, the pilots were coming in for a landing in a storm. And pilots have to make go, no-go decisions as a regular course of their duties. And in this case, they had to decide whether or not it was safe enough to land the aircraft in this storm. Now, it turns out it was a severe storm. And after NTSB investigated the accident, one of the things they do is they have equivalently trained pilots in a simulator to run out that scenario and determine what the training would actually result in terms of pilot performance. None of the pilots would have made the decision to land that aircraft. It's a classic example, in this case, of the pilots who are sleep deprived, determining that it was better for them to land the aircraft in this severe storm rather than diverting. They underestimated the risk associated with the storm, and they overestimated the benefit of getting that plane on the ground at that particular airport to reduce any inconvenience or cost to the airline. And so it's a simple example, although tragic, of people not being who they're trained to be when they're sleep deprived. This is an example. This is a train that crashed. It failed to make a turn. Trains are incredibly heavy vehicles. And so in order to slow a train down, you must begin that process well in advance of, say, a hazard or a turn in this case. And what the investigation showed is that the engineer operating the train actually fell asleep, and subsequent investigation determined that he had sleep apnea. So even though this individual was actually trying to get sleep, because of a undiagnosed condition, the person had sleep apnea and they weren't actually getting the sleep that they thought they were getting. And so it led to chronic daytime fatigue. And this individual fell asleep just for a moment, but unfortunately they fell asleep right at a time when they would have been getting the signal to slow the train down. And so what happens here is that by the time the person's aware of the mistake and the failure to slow the train down, it's too late, and that train can't be slowed down in time to make the turn. All right, so here's a final example. This is another train accident. This is where a passenger train is hit by a freight train. And what the Transportation Safety Board investigators suspected is that the CN crew, the freight train crew, had fallen asleep and missed a signal. And because of that, they ended up on the wrong track. And that led to this tragedy. Critical factors. In summary, what I want you to understand is that shift length is a dramatic contributing factor to accidents, fatigue-related accidents. And the driver there is really sustained wakefulness. So it's not just shift length, but it's how long the person has been awake in advance of that shift as well as during the shift. So sustained wakefulness is a key. Sleep intrusions are a key as well. Think of sleep intrusions as just the brain reaching a point where it can no longer sustain wakefulness. So it literally reboots. It's a period of time where the individual is unaware that they've fallen asleep. These are micro sleep intrusions. They happen very quickly and they don't last long, but it's at that period of time, the person has completely lost situational awareness. And so they're at the mercy of their environment. And if you fall asleep at a time that's critical, accidents are going to happen. Time of day, as I've been saying over and over throughout this talk, time of day is a key driver. There are these periods of time that increase our fatigue risk. And it's just a function of when our brain is programmed to sleep. During the core body temperature minimum, that's a key driver of fatigue risk. That's that time from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. when we are programmed for REM sleep. And so it's very hard for an individual to sustain sleep. And again, these are involuntary periods where a person will have a sleep intrusion. The other period of time is the afternoon lull. And the reason the afternoon lull is a risk zone is simply that we are pre-programmed to have an afternoon nap. So European cultures that have siestas in the mid-afternoon, they've got circadian physiology correct. They understand that that is a time when we're supposed to nap. But in North American cultures, we don't typically nap. And so we have increased fatigue risk at that time. And then finally, let me conclude this section by saying that errors in judgment, we need to understand that people aren't who they are trained to be when they're fatigued. When they aren't getting the sleep they need, there's going to be errors in judgment. And you might be thinking to yourself, what was this person thinking? There's no way they should have attempted that landing at that time. Or there's no way that they should have decided that it was safe to use these O-rings. But what happens is that we aren't who we're trained to be when we're sleep deprived. All right, so that concludes that section. So now let's get into some of the reasons why. Hopefully you all appreciate the importance of your sleep. And then you might be saying to yourself, well, Glenn, that's a no-brainer. I know I need to sleep. I'm tired. But the thing is, I can't sleep. I try to sleep, but I can't. So let's get into the next section where we talk about why that might be the case. First off, let's start with understanding that how well you slept isn't simply a function of how you feel in the morning when you wake up. There's a difference between our perception of sleep, which is important, and also the objective measurement of sleep. So think back a few moments ago when I talked about sleep apnea and the train engineer who, believed that he was doing what he needed to do in terms of getting the right sleep. But because he had a undiagnosed condition called sleep apnea, the sleep he was getting wasn't the sleep he needed. So this is why I bring up the importance of objective measurement. So here I'm using the example of Fitbit. There are a number of wearable technologies that are available to us. Fitbit, in my experience, is best in class in terms of something called sleep architecture. So this is an example of elite sleep. Now, this is my sleep using the Fitbit as measurement. Now, make no mistake, I am a trained professional. I've worked for a long time to train my brain and body to be able to get this kind of sleep, but this is really what we're shooting for. Now, one more thing to mention, earlier on a slide, I talked about dementia. Well, there is a strong relationship between dementia and sleep health over decades. And so one of the reasons that I am so careful about my sleep is that we have a family history of Alzheimer's disease. Essentially, what it means is that we have a gene that predisposes my family toward Alzheimer's disease. And it turns out in 2013, the science really started to evolve on this, but it turns out that people that have that gene, if they are among the very best sleepers in the world, it negates the impact of that gene. Essentially, what I'm telling you is that to the extent that biology is destiny, our genetic makeup determines a lot about who we are. But what we do in our lives has a huge impact on how those genes play out. So I am highly motivated to make sure that I protect my sleep, because by being an elite sleeper, it negates the impact of these genes, the negative impact. And so here's an example of a night. I typically am going to bed at 10 and I'm sleeping until 7 in the morning. And the reason I do that, remember I said that we need 7 to 9 hours of actual sleep. Well, in my case, my target is 8 hours of actual sleep. So I need a 9-hour sleep window to get that. What you can see is that from the point that I go to bed, it doesn't take very long for me to fall asleep. And then I get deep sleep very quickly upon having fallen asleep. In fact, you can see in the front half, there's a lot of this deep sleep. That is the slow wave sleep that I was telling you about earlier that washes the brain. So in this front half, I'm spending a lot of time washing my brain and removing away the day's toxicity. Not only does it do that, but slow wave sleep also promotes growth, restoration, repair of tissues throughout the brain and body, and it plays a key role in immune system functioning. So getting a ton of deep sleep in the front half is important. Then in the back half, you see there's this big change. There's much less deep sleep, but in fact, there's a lot more light sleep alternating with REM sleep. Now, light sleep is a misnomer. It doesn't necessarily mean poor sleep. In fact, light sleep's really important sleep because it processes the day. We are inundated with information throughout the day. Some of it is critical information that is necessary for future success, and then the rest of it can be ignored or discarded. And light sleep plays a role in processing the day and tagging learning that must be remembered for future success. Important details or important information that we need for future success. And then ignoring the rest, if you will. Getting signal to noise ratio correct and eliminating the noise. That's light sleep. Another thing that light sleep does is it consolidates learning and memory for a particular form of memory. And you can think of that as skill acquisition. The muscle memory that we need to be able to evaluate a situation and automatically respond correctly. That's muscle memory, and light sleep plays a huge role in processing that muscle memory. So any skill acquisition, like being able to play the piano, a musical instrument, being able to ride a bike, being able to throw a curveball instead of a fastball, or things like this, any kind of muscle memory or skill acquisition, you can think light sleep consolidates that learning and memory. REM sleep's really important for a different type of consolidation of memory, and that is knowledge acquisition. Think of facts, figures, times, dates, places, names, the things that you need to remember that you are processing during the day for future success. That's REM sleep. And REM sleep also plays a role in processing trauma. Traumatic events are actually learning events that are tagged with a very negative emotion. So something tragic happens. And so the learning there is to either make sure that we never let that happen again, or make sure that we always do this. Otherwise, something really bad can happen. That kind of emotional tag is a negative emotional tag that triggers the fight or flight response. And what REM sleep does is it processes that trauma. It removes the negative emotional tag so that you can learn from the event without having to relive the fight or flight response associated with that event. And so that's one of the things that REM sleep does. So knowledge acquisition, processing trauma, and building resilience to stressors. When we talked about anger management earlier, that's REM sleep, being able to boost our resilience to the irritants that we're faced with through the day. So here's an example of elite sleep. Now, not going to be a surprise to you that most people aren't getting this kind of sleep on a nightly basis. In fact, Fitbit data, aggregate data on millions of users around the world, has provided insight that we've kind of known for decades that sleep is changing in our society. Over the last 2 decades, there's been a profound change. Note that individuals, if I were to use round numbers here, are going to bed around 11:30 at night, and they're getting up around 7:30. If you do the math on that, that's roughly an 8-hour sleep window. So you would think that they're doing well in terms of getting the sleep they need. In fact, they aren't. The average Fitbit user, even though they've got 8 hours in bed trying to sleep, they're getting less than 7 hours of sleep each night. And this is problematic. One of the key drivers is something we call normal age-related changes in sleep. This is a normal course of aging. And now we're seeing it happen beginning in our 30s. So what used to be a change that we would see in adults that were 65 plus, we're now beginning to see these changes play out much, much earlier in our 30s. Here's an example of really good sleep in an older adult. Now, this isn't Fitbit data. This is, again, think research grade Fitbit. This is data from our lab over a decade ago. And what you see is not sleep architecture, but what you're seeing is each horizontal row here is a 24-hour day. The pink shaded area is the time when the individual is trying to sleep. And so what you can see is 2 weeks of recordings, and that's the benefit of this research grade Fitbit, if you will. It's not a Fitbit, it's called the Motion Watch, but at the time it was best in class. And what we were seeing is these black vertical deflections are the activity, the motion that's captured from the wrist wearable. And what you can see is an estimate, and this gives us an estimate if the person was in a sleep lab all hooked up to something called polysomnography. Think of brain electrodes that are measuring sleep. If they were, this would give us an estimate of what that data would look like. The difference is that instead of being in the lab, they're at home in the comfort of their own sleeping environment, and they're able to wear this device for 2 weeks or far longer than that. And so what we have is an estimate of sleep duration. In this case, the person's getting just over 7.5 hours of sleep. Sleep efficiency is the percent of time they're actually sleeping for the amount of time they're spending in bed, and anything 90% or higher is excellent. And fragmentation is just a period of time. Think of it as the frequency of sleep disruption. When we look at this sleep window, you can see there's not very much activity. They're sleeping almost the entire sleep window. That is not the norm, but it does give you a sense that it is possible for an older adult to get really good sleep. Here's what we would more typically see. A sleep duration, even though they're spending almost 8 hours in bed, they're getting just over 6 hours. This is 6 hours, 8 minutes of actual sleep. Their sleep efficiency is much, much lower. It's just over 75%. And their fragmentation index is very, very high. You can see it when we break the sleep window into two halves. The front half, with the exception of these two awakenings, the front half looks like much, much closer to what we saw in the previous chart, where the person's able to fall asleep and stay asleep for about 3-4 hours. But then in the back half, we begin to see these awakenings, and having awoken, the individual has much greater difficulty getting back to sleep. And that's where we see the fragmentation, the frequency of sleep disruption. Okay, so this is what we would call age-related change in sleep. So it's normal. We see this, we've known about it for decades, but it isn't healthy. And what I'm happy to tell you is it need not be inevitable. When we look at people in the sleep lab, we see the exact same thing. When we compare older adults to younger adults, we can see that they're spending the same amount of time in bed, total recording time, TRT, same amount of time in bed, but the older adult is spending much more time awake than the younger adult. You can see the older adult, again, getting just over 6 hours of actual sleep for a sleep window that is roughly 8 hours. And yet the young adult is getting almost 7.5 hours sleep for that period of time. The sleep efficiencies are vastly different. The older adult is getting just over 77, let's say less than 80%, whereas the young adult is getting 90% sleep efficiency. What I'm really showing you here, these two numbers matter because they are predictive of accelerated aging, what I talked about earlier. Sleep durations less than 7 hours and sleep efficiencies less than 80% are predictive of accelerated aging. Think dementia, cardiovascular disease, obesity, type 2 diabetes, cancer. All of those factors, accelerated aging, are a function of this poor sleep. When we look at the actual sleep architecture now for a moment, we can see that the deficit is most profound in this stage of sleep, stage 4. In fact, stage 4 is that slow wave sleep. It is the stage that is 100% slow waves. It's the stage when the brain is being washed of the day's waste. And so not only are older adults getting less sleep, but they aren't washing their brains near enough. Here's an example of what that would look like in terms of Fitbit data. So Fitbit is it's a reasonably cost-effective device. It doesn't cost a great deal of money, and it's something that's available to all of us, and we can get insight into our own sleep. And this is an example of what I was talking about earlier in terms of poor sleep health. These individuals getting nowhere near the sleep that they really need. You can see that they're not getting the deep sleep in the front half. And that order matters because you want to wash your brain in the front half of sleep and then use that well-washed brain in the back half to consolidate learning and memory. So you can see that the sleep architecture is out of sequence. And also there are these long awakenings that are happening. All right, so now let's move on to talk about drugs, another thing that can have a profound impact on people's sleep. Here's an example of an individual. This is a client who came to us. They had struggled with sleep for a long time. And so they were actually on a combination of a sleep aid as well as CBD to aid in falling asleep, decreasing anxiety, and being able to fall asleep. And what we can see in the sleep architecture is profound. The person is able to fall asleep. They have a late bedtime, but they're able to fall asleep and they get a lot of deep sleep in the front half. But what's interesting is that they aren't getting near the REM that they would really want to be getting. And it is a function of the combination of the two drugs that they have in their system. The first, the sleep aid, promotes deep sleep. So you can see this promotion of deep sleep. But you can't be in deep sleep while at the same time in REM. They are mutually exclusive. These are independent stages of sleep that are very different. And so you can't be in both at the same time. You're either in deep or you're in REM. So having a drug in the system that promotes deep means that you're not going to be getting as much REM. And then in the back half, you can see that there isn't REM here, and that's a function of CBD. CBD is a potent REM inhibitor. So a key thing to remember is that there are pluses and minuses to drugs. And so we want to look at our sleep architecture. Here's another example of a drug that is commonly used, alcohol. And alcohol is very often used by older adults to help them fall asleep. And they think because they have difficulty sustaining sleep in the back half, they want to have some alcohol in their system, thinking that that's going to help them. And the problem is that alcohol, if you drink enough of it, absolutely will help you fall asleep. But the sleep architecture is very different than what you would need. You'll see that they do get a bit of deep sleep in the front, but then they don't get deep sleep after that, and it alters their REM structure as well. So alcohol is not healthy for sleep. It can help you fall asleep, but the sleep you get isn't going to be the sleep you need because it alters the amount of deep as well as the amount of REM sleep that you're going to get. So what you can think of alcohol as a drug that will give you a pharmacologically induced sleep, but not a healthy sleep. Here's another example of drugs that are commonly used. In this case, this is Adderall, a stimulant that's used during the day to address attention deficit disorder for the adult. That this is a client. And what we identified very quickly with this client is that they weren't getting the sleep architecture in the middle part of their sleep. They were able to fall asleep and get deep sleep. But then after a brief period of sleep, there was this rhythmic disruption to their sleep. And this is an impact of the Adderall. That's essentially amphetamine that's in their system. And the treatment was to address the timing and the dose of the drug so that we could unhandcuff the sleep accountant so that we could get a drug-free sleep window. So the drug was in the system during the day as it was needed, but that it was given enough time to dissipate and be processed so that it wasn't impacting nighttime sleep. Here's a different example of an impact of drug. This is my data. During this recording, I had to take antihistamines. It was a particularly bad allergy season that had come early. I try very hard not to take drugs, but in this case, I needed the antihistamine or else I wasn't going to get any sleep at all. And what you can see when you compare it to, remember my previous sleep where I was getting lots of deep and lots of REM, the antihistamine actually inhibited the REM sleep. And so I wasn't getting near the REM that I otherwise would. And this is what happened after I came off the antihistamines, and you can see a ton of REM sleep. It is what we call a REM rebound. Because I have really protected my sleep, I can have an impact of, say, antihistamines or doing something, and then the next night I can get right back to a really healthy sleep. Earlier, I talked about windstorms and how they can have an impact on my sleep. The reason, this is an example of hypervigilance, but the reason is we had a tree that fell on our house and actually went through our bedroom. And I was in the house at the time. It happened during the day. I was the only person in the house at the time, thankfully. I was uninjured, but it had a huge impact on our house. And it was a frightening event. And now, whenever there's a windstorm during the night when I'm trying to sleep, my recollection is that I slept the whole night. But what you can see here is the impact. This is essentially the fight or flight response that's telling me while I'm sleeping, this isn't safe. The sound of the wind and branches that are hitting the roof, that sound triggers a fight or flight response for me. And even though I'm not awake, I'm actually sleeping, you can see that it dramatically disrupts the sleep architecture. All right, here's an example of me going the extra mile for everyone in today's group. This is an example of me having friends over, drinking beer heavily, and you can see that there is this dose response. The more you drink, the worse your sleep. I was able to, recover the next day having done that. And so this is an important thing for everyone to take home. The message here is that if you protect your sleep window and do a really good job protecting your sleep, you can have a night celebrating a big win or whatever it might be, and then recover and get the sleep you need. All right, so those are some of the reasons why we don't get the sleep that we need. And now I'm going to take you through, now please understand it's a brief session here. I'm not going to be able to solve all the sleep problems in the room, but I want to introduce you to why circadian rhythms are the secret to sleep health. Circadian rhythms are daily biological rhythms. You can think of it as we have daytime physiology, biology, and behavior, and we have nighttime physiology, biology, and behavior. And they need to be kept separate in time because they're incompatible processes. Day must be day and night must be night. If you think back to the World Health Organization study that showed that shift work that causes us to turn our nights into days and our days into nights actually causes accelerated aging and causes cancer. Well, the reason is because we're turning nighttime physiology into the day and daytime physiology into the night. And the bad news that I have for you is that you don't need to be a shift worker to do that. In fact, because sleep is the first thing we sacrifice to meet the growing demands of work, family, and social life balance, because we adjust our sleep schedule to meet whatever the demands are for that night or week, it causes us circadian dysregulation. So the answer is to promote strong circadian rhythms, to tell your brain and body exactly what time it is. Day must be day, and it's signaled by lots of exposure to UV protected exposure to sunlight. We evolved as hunter-gatherers on the plains. Think of it as our day we spent almost exclusively outside getting daylight. Now that's dramatically changed for most of us. Many of us are working indoors. Some of us are working indoors all day long. And because of that, it can have a huge impact on our circadian signaling. Meal times are another really important time cue. And meal times, think of it as access to food is a daytime signal, and then fasting or the absence of food access is a signal of night. Shift workers are very often eating during the shift at night, and so they are taking daytime and they're imposing it into the night, which has a huge impact on our overall health. And then finally, the other very important time cue is activity, not just exercise, but just breaking up sedentary time. So activity or being active, think hunter-gatherers on the plains that had to do a lot to, acquire the food, resources, shelter, all of the things that they need to survive. We evolved to be very active during the day and then not active at all at night for the most part. And so day is signaled by light, access to food, and activity. And night is signaled by absence of light, think darkness, absence of food, think fasting, and the absence of activity, think sedentary time. So the key is to coordinate time cues so that we get more light during the day, we get more food during the day, and more activity during the day. We need to be consistent with our signaling. And then the final piece that I would add is that we have to protect our nap time. We need, whenever possible, the afternoon lull is the right time to take a nap, just to pay off some of the sleep debt. Imagine you aren't getting the sleep you need at night. An afternoon nap can be protective. Okay, so here's the recipe that I want you to take home with you. The first thing to understand is if we're going to take the circadian shift out of our nighttime, if we're going to take the circadian shift out of shift work and we're going to anchor our circadian rhythms to the day, we still may need to work at night, but we can stop this shifting. And the key is to build a sleep window and protect that window by what we do during the day and at night when we can't sleep. So you want to be very consistent about this sleep schedule. And then during the day, wherever possible, for as long as possible, you want to get as much UV protected exposure to daylight as you possibly can. So that is the key, is getting lots of light during the day. Also, scheduling our meal times. Please remember this adage, and forgive the gender bias here, but breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, and dinner like a pauper. We want to front load our calories. And for most of us, we've got this wrong. The ideal scenario is to have a big breakfast that's synchronized to match the first light exposure. So getting, sunlight in the morning when you're waking up, having a big breakfast, and then being active. A large lunch and a smaller dinner. Now, for most of us, we got this wrong because dinner is usually the largest meal of the day. In fact, most of us don't even have time for breakfast. And then lunch is on the go and, whenever possible. It's dinner that is typically the most predictable meal. And it's also the largest meal for many of us. And what happens there is that we're telling our brain and our body that this is actually the beginning of day. And the other problem for many of us is that we're having this meal far too close to our sleep window. We want to have our final meal at least 4 to 5 hours before bedtime. The reason for that is that the food, it doesn't take 4 to 5 hours to digest a meal necessarily, but the reason is because there are downstream impacts of that meal. And so if we have this meal too close to our bedtime, we actually end up contaminating our nighttime sleep with daytime food processing. So that's a key. Finally, we want to make sure that we are active after meals. Think of it as we want to use the food we eat. Melatonin is a hormone that prepares the brain and body for sleep. And so what we want to do is allow that melatonin begins to rise a couple hours before our normal bedtime. And so what we want to do to preserve this melatonin onset is to make sure that we're avoiding light in the 2 hours. In particular, we want to avoid blue light because blue light turns off melatonin. We want to avoid blue light in the 2 hours before our bedtime, and we want to avoid it throughout the entire night. So think of it as no food, no light, no activity during our nighttime sleep. All right, so now I'm going to open it up to questions. Hopefully we've given you some time to answer questions.
Yeah, thank you, Glenn. That was really informative, and it's kind of giving me some insight into some of the struggles I'm having. But yeah, now I'd like to invite questions from the audience through the Q&A. And we'll do our best to address as many as we can before our time is up today. So, first question. How does this information give employers ways to improve safety? We can't just not have people working night shift. What does an employer do with this research?
Yeah, that's an awesome question, and thank you for bringing it up. So let me be very clear. Shift work is necessary. We live in a 24-hour society, so it's not going away. I actually alluded to it earlier when I said the key to surviving shift work, and in fact, thriving in a shift work environment, is taking away this circadian shifting. So to answer the question, what we need to do is manage that shift work so that the individual has better control of light, food, and activity during the shift. And a key factor, and we don't have the time to go into this, to be honest with you, we have a online think Netflix for sleep health, if you will, a program designed specifically for shift workers called Surviving Shift Work. And it teaches them exactly how to manage light exposure in a shift work paradigm so that they are able to use their circadian rhythms and manage them properly to remove circadian shifting at night. And essentially the recipe is very similar to what I just showed you. So let me just go back to sharing the screen for a moment. That question is really important. The key here, imagine a shift worker. A shift worker in this part of the night is on shift, okay? And this is a part of the time where they would normally be getting a lot of light. And what you want to do is manage that light exposure and remove the blue where possible. So we can do that very quickly with orange tinted lenses. These are actually safety goggles, UVEX safety goggles. We could eliminate blue light in the front half of the the shift so that they're not causing a circadian shift. And we can manage through training to get people to understand that they want to anchor their meal times correctly. So having a properly scheduled dinner in advance of the shift, but then not eating or minimizing the food or changing the types of food that they eat during the shift can also alter circadian shifting. And then in the back half, fatigue risk management is a key driver here. And in the back half, we want people to actually get bright blue light so that they are not falling asleep or they're less likely to fall asleep on the shift. There's a host of factors that we can do to train employers to better position their employees for success on the night shift.
That's fascinating. And so do you have any examples where a major accident or a set of events were avoided due to alert operators?
That's an awesome question. And you know what? It's often very difficult to prove the negative. And I'm sorry that I don't. A lot of times what happens is when a disaster is averted, people will either not realize that the disaster was averted. They'll think of it as they got lucky on this one. And so I don't have an example to give to you.
This is a really fascinating question. And I've often wondered about this as well. So physicians are taught to stay awake for 36 hours without restful sleep.
Yeah.
What types of errors can be made during the time frame beyond 24 hours?
Man, that's such an important question. Okay, so let me explain one thing. So this is one of those things where, you know, it doesn't make a lot of sense. The medical community, they're trained in an environment where they're chronically sleep deprived. So, and, you know, when they make a mistake, people can die at least. And so you would think, okay, well, why is it that we don't see it? Well, number one, a lot of times the mistakes aren't publicized. There are a number of mistakes that are made, fatigue-related mistakes, and this is something that's being studied in greater detail. But let me explain why there aren't as many as you might expect. So the first is to understand what happens for a sleep-deprived individual. In the medical community, you know, a lot of their processing is automated in the sense that, you know, if A, B, or C patient presents with these symptoms, then do D, E, and F. Okay, so they have routines. And now this is really interesting. When we are sleep deprived, we're actually better at following our routine. Think muscle memory. And so when we're sleep deprived, we actually become far better at doing automated processing. It's because the frontal cortex, the executive functioning, isn't operating at that point. It's just routine automatic processing. But when something happens that's outside of the norm, think of that 3 Mile Island accident where they followed the procedures, but they weren't able to identify what was going wrong when things weren't happening as scripted. And so that's a lot of what we see in the medical community when they're making errors. It's the inability to have creative problem solving. And so what happens is they get stuck on their script and they aren't able to think outside the box. Now, let me give you a real world example that I lived through. So as a PhD, I was studying sleep deprivation, which meant that I was sleep deprived very often as I was sleep depriving subjects. And I have a research assistant that's with me to, assist in the study. And on this particular occasion, I had to take the research assistant and drive them home on my way home. And so we've just completed a 24-hour sleep deprivation study, and we're done. We're relieved to be done. Everybody's safe and sound. And so we're driving home. Now, I live in North Delta. Student research assistant lived in New Westminster. It's right on the way home from Simon Fraser University. We're driving, we're talking, we're, excited about the fact that we, made it through yet another study. And I get all the way home. I'm pulling into my driveway while talking to my research assistant. In other words, both of us completely missed the fact that we were supposed to drop them off. And so what happened there is automatic processing: red light, stop; green light, go; avoid traffic, all of those things. But when something out of the norm happens, sleep deprivation, that's where you really see it kick in. So there are impacts, and we can predict these impacts. And so when we talk about fatigue risk management, it's not just scheduling safety critical tasks outside of these fatigue risk zones, but it's understanding, how will sleep deprivation have its greatest impact, its most risky impact on things. And so again, far more than what we have time to do today, but there are things we can do. And training is important, not just for the employer, but for employees as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember when I was younger, I did shift work, and there would be times where I got home and I had no idea how I did that.
Yeah.
Very, very frightening, actually.
Yeah.
So another interesting question. So how does sleep quality factor into this discussion? For example, sleeping very lightly or waking up multiple times during the night regularly? And does it matter if you sleep, a 1 10-hour solid session or 2 5-hour sessions?
Yeah, such an important question. So let's go back to sharing the screen. This is what I want people to take away from today, is that you can't just wake up in the morning and how you feel in the morning will tell you a little bit about how you slept, but it won't tell you much about the sleep architecture. In fact, very quickly, how you feel when you wake up says more about the stage that you woke up out of. If you wake up out of deep sleep to start your day, you're going to feel really groggy. In fact, you're going to feel like you haven't had very much sleep. It's something called sleep inertia. If you wake up out of light sleep, you won't have that grogginess as much, but you're not going to feel alert yet. In fact, it's not until you wake up out of REM that you feel alert and ready to go. And so how you feel when you wake up tells you more about the stage of sleep that you woke up out of and less about the full night's sleep. In fact, it isn't until, let's say that you have a typical sleep window of going to bed at 11, getting up at 7. And so it isn't until the mid-afternoon, say you're getting up at 7, well, 6 hours later is 1 o'clock. And between the hours of 1 to 4, for that example, is when you're going to really see and feel fatigue. And if you feel chronically fatigued during that time, it's a very strong indicator that you're not getting either the sleep duration that you need or the sleep architecture that you need. And both are important, right? We need deep sleep. We need proper sleep architecture. And so that's why I showed you the elite sleep. We need deep sleep in the front half, washing our brain, growing new neurons, restoring and repairing tissues throughout the brain and body. And then in the back half, having that well-washed brain, we want to use it to consolidate learning and memory, process trauma, build resilience, all of the wonderful things that sleep does. Sleep architecture matters. And we're lucky because in today's world, we have access to our sleep data if we just take the time and invest some money to look at how we're doing.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And there are so many wonderful questions, but we have time for one last question. So the next question is about whether or not there are other factors and comorbidities that affect a person's circadian rhythm. So, for example, any advice for perimenopausal women?
Oh, it's an awesome question. Okay. Well, now let me be clear. There's no cure, if you will, for menopause. But what I will tell you is that how menopause plays out for the individual is impacted by their circadian rhythm. And if you have really strong circadian rhythms, then you will have and I'm just going to show you with my hands here. So a really strong circadian rhythm, high amplitude. This is clearly day and this is clearly night. What happens with menopause is you have these fluctuations, not only in body temperature, but cognitive functioning. There's these swings, if you will. And if you have those swings within a very strong high amplitude circadian rhythm, the lived experience is less severe. But if you have a flattened out circadian rhythm and then you have high amplitude fluctuation that is a function of menopause, the lived experience is going to be far more impactful and it's going to feel more severe. I'm not saying that it's all circadian rhythms. It isn't, but it can play a role. Now, in terms of other factors that drive circadian rhythms, we are all born with, for the most part, not born. We develop them as part of the development as an infant. And after about 6 months, we really begin to have strong circadian rhythms. And so from 6 to 18 months is the development process. And by 18 months, we have if we've done what we need, we have very strong circadian rhythms. We're born with the ability to get the sleep we need. What I want people to take away in conclusion here is that how we live our lives in today's society actually trains that ability out of us, and it actually weakens our circadian rhythms. And so training, not just for the employee, but for the employer to understand what drives these circadian rhythms and to understand how we can promote stronger circadian rhythms is the key to improving sleep health.
Wonderful. Thank you. Again, we're going to have to stop there with the questions. I think we could probably go on. I think you, Glenn, you predicted it when we talked earlier, and I have a bunch, so I'll have to email you personally because there's a few things on my mind. But again, thanks, Glenn, so much for sharing your insights and thoughts with us today.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Wonderful. Thank you. So, and again, to everyone in our audience today, thank you for joining us and sharing your questions. If we didn't get to your question, and I know we didn't because there was a lot of them, we'll do our best to respond to them in the follow-up. And any questions not answered here, Dr. Landry will answer later, and we'll share those answers on the website for everyone to view. If you weren't aware, next Wednesday, February 22nd, is Pink Shirt Day. And it's a day to raise awareness about bullying, what it is, and what we can do to prevent it. To help understand this important issue, we will be hosting another webinar on that day where I will be talking about harassment and bullying in the workplace. This webinar is open to all, and you can find out more details on our website or the link posted in the chat. I'm also excited to announce that we'll be hosting the first ever Make It Safe Okanagan this spring, a one-day educational conference event in Kelowna this April. So stay tuned and watch out for registration news that's going to be coming out soon. And be sure to save the date for the 2023 Safety Pinnacle Awards Gala coming up Thursday, June 8th. We can't wait to recognize so many companies and individuals for the work they've done to inspire and strengthen health and safety within their company and in their communities. So we invite all of you to join the excitement that evening in Surrey. Visit us online anytime for help or to access our full library of webinars, resources, and training. And watch for an email tomorrow with a link to the recording of today's session and a survey link to share your feedback, topics, and ideas. And again, thanks so much for attending. Thank you, Dr. Landry. That was really fascinating, and I know I learned a lot. And I'm gonna, I feel hopeful that I'm gonna have better sleep if I just pay attention and listen to you. But thank you, everybody, for attending today.